For 12 years, I gave my family $3,200 every month, covering my parents' mortgage, my younger sister's car insurance, and my brother's phone bill. But when I lost my job, they did not say a single word to me for 64 days. So I decided to send a spreadsheet to each of them, exposing every penny. For the first time in my life, Thanksgiving was canceled and I took back the house they were living in. My name is Leah. I am 34 years old, and I used to be a financial risk analyst in Chicago before my life turned completely upside down. My family treated me like a human ATM until the machine finally broke. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who only loved you for your wallet. Growing up in a suburb outside of Detroit, I was always the responsible one. My parents, Frank and Linda, praised me whenever I brought home good grades, but their praise always came with an invisible price tag. They expected a return on their investment. When I graduated with a finance degree and landed a high-paying job in Chicago, the requests started immediately. First, it was helping with a late utility bill. Then it was co-signing a car loan for my sister Kayla. Eventually, it snowballed into me taking over my parents' entire mortgage payments because my father claimed his business was struggling. For over a decade, I funneled a massive portion of my income into keeping their lives afloat. I sacrificed my own vacations, delayed buying my own property, and lived far below my means just to ensure they never faced the consequences of their financial irresponsibility. Then the corporate restructuring happened. My company laid off 20% of its workforce and my entire department was eliminated. I was escorted out of the building with a cardboard box of my belongings and a severance package that barely cushioned the blow. That evening, I sent a straightforward email to our family group chat, explaining that I had been laid off and would need to adjust my finances immediately. I also updated my professional networking profile to indicate I was looking for new opportunities. I expected panic. I expected a flood of calls from my parents worrying about how they would pay their bills. I even foolishly expected a little bit of sympathy from the people I had supported for my entire adult life. Instead, I got absolute silence. Day 1 turned into day 7 and then day 14. The family group chat remained completely dead. No one called to ask how I was holding up. No one texted to see if I needed help with groceries or rent. They just vanished. But they did not vanish from the internet. I watched in quiet horror as my mother posted photos from a wine tasting event on social media. I saw my 28-year-old sister Kayla posting videos of her unboxing expensive makeup. My 31-year-old brother Brandon was constantly updating his feed with clips of his band practicing in a rented studio. They were living their lives perfectly fine, completely ignoring the fact that their primary source of income had just lost her livelihood. As the weeks dragged on, the silence morphed from hurtful to deeply revealing. I realized they were not giving me space to process my job loss. They were giving me the silent treatment because I was no longer useful to them. They were waiting for me to magically fix my situation and resume the cash flow without them having to deal with the messy emotional reality of my unemployment. Sitting alone in my Chicago apartment, I watched my savings dwindle. I realized that the auto-pay settings for their various bills were still active on my accounts. My parents' mortgage, Brandon's phone plan, Kayla's auto insurance. The money was bleeding out of my accounts while they pretended I did not exist. On day 60, I logged into my banking portal and systematically canceled every single auto-pay connection associated with my family. I removed my credit cards from their shared accounts. I unlinked my checking account from their payment portals. I locked down my finances with the clinical precision of the risk analyst I was trained to be. I knew it would only take a few days for the services to be suspended. It took exactly 4 days. On day 64 of my unemployment, a Tuesday morning, my phone finally rang. It shattered the quiet of my apartment, the screen flashing with Brandon's name. I answered the call, preparing myself for a belated apology, or perhaps a fake display of sibling concern. I was wrong. "Leah, have you completely lost your mind?" Brandon screamed the second the call connected. Why is my phone service suspended? And my Spotify family plan is gone. I am literally setting up for a massive live stream right now and my hotspot is dead. Do you know how unprofessional this makes me look? He was breathless with rage, his voice echoing through the speaker of my phone. There was no hello, no how are you doing, just pure, unadulterated entitlement. I sat at my kitchen counter staring at the gray city skyline outside my window and felt an icy calm wash over my entire body. The years of guilt and obligation I had carried simply evaporated in the face of his audacity. I lost my job, Brandon. I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. I posted about it 2 months ago. I sent an email to the family group chat. I do not have an income right now. Yeah, so what? Brandon scoffed, his tone dripping with disgust. You have savings, Leah. You have been making 6 figures for years. You are seriously going to cut off my phone over $100? You are ruining my career over pocket change. My producer is trying to call me right now, and I cannot even receive text messages unless I am on Wi-Fi. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer madness of a 31-year-old man throwing a tantrum over a phone bill his younger sister had been paying since he was a teenager. I am not spending my emergency fund on your data plan, I told him clearly. You are a grown man. You need to set up your own account and pay for your own music subscriptions. He groaned loudly, a childish sound of extreme frustration. You are so selfish, Leah. You are literally just sitting around your apartment doing nothing while I am actually trying to build a brand. You know how hard the music industry is. Just put your card back on the account today. I will pay you back when I get monetized. Absolutely not, I replied. The bank is closed. My wallet is closed. You are a terrible sister, Brandon spat. Do not come crying to me when you realize how lonely you are up there in your fancy apartment. He slammed the phone down, ending the call abruptly. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the black screen. 64 days of silence broken only by a demand for money and a string of insults. The true nature of my family was laid bare in a 3-minute phone call. I walked over to the coffee maker, feeling a strange sense of liberation. The worst had happened. The mask had fallen off. I did not have to pretend anymore. But as I was pouring my coffee, my phone buzzed with an urgent notification from my banking app. It was a fraud alert for a backup credit card I kept locked in a drawer and rarely used. I tapped the notification, my blood running cold as I read the screen. A charge had just been approved for $1,200 at a Prada boutique in my hometown. Someone had my card information and I knew exactly who it was. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the $1,200 charge from a Prada boutique burning into my retinas. The sheer audacity of it left me momentarily paralyzed. I had explicitly cut off their allowances, yet somehow my account was still bleeding. I did not waste time screaming into the void. I dialed my mother directly. Linda answered on the second ring. Her voice was dripping with that artificial sweetness she always used when she knew she had been caught doing something wrong. Leah, sweetie, it is so good to hear from you. We have been so busy lately. Save the pleasantries, Mom. I said, my tone ice cold. Why did I just get a fraud alert for a $1,200 designer bag on my backup credit card? There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Instead of answering me, I heard the distinct beep of a call being merged. My mother was bringing reinforcements. A second later, 2 more voices connected to the line. It was my father, Frank, and my 28-year-old sister, Kayla. My mother had orchestrated a digital firing squad. Leah, why are you attacking Mom? Kayla whined immediately. Her voice had that grating, high-pitched tone she used whenever she wanted to play the victim. I bought the bag, and I needed it. I have a huge interview tomorrow at a top-tier marketing firm. I cannot walk in there looking like trash. You know how important appearances are in my industry. You bought a $1,200 purse with my credit card without asking me, I replied, refusing to let her change the narrative. That is not borrowing for an interview. That is theft. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Frank's booming voice echoed through the speaker. My father always spoke as if he were commanding a room of unruly employees, a habit he kept despite his failing business. Your sister is trying to build a career. You should be supporting her instead of acting like a miser over a single purse. You make 6 figures. Stop embarrassing this family with your penny pinching. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white. I am unemployed, Dad. I lost my job over 2 months ago. I told all of you this. I literally do not have an income. Well, whose fault is that? Frank snapped back without missing a beat. You probably talked back to your boss. You always had a problem with authority. Do not punish your sister just because you could not keep your mouth shut and hold down a job. I listened to the man whose mortgage I had paid for 12 years tell me I was a failure for losing my job. It was a special kind of psychological warfare. They were completely ignoring reality, substituting it with a version where I was simply a greedy villain withholding their rightful allowance. I am returning the bag, Kayla, I stated firmly. Take it back to the store today, or I will report the charge as fraudulent to the bank. Kayla immediately burst into loud theatrical sobs. You are ruining my life. You always want me to fail. You are just jealous because I am actually going to be famous while you sit alone in your apartment doing nothing. Leah, look what you have done, Linda scolded, her voice rising in defensive anger. You made your sister cry. You are acting entirely irrational, and since we are all on the phone anyway, we need to discuss a real problem. The $2,500 mortgage payment is due this Friday. You need to transfer the funds by tomorrow morning so the check clears in time. The sheer whiplash of the conversation was staggering. In the span of 3 minutes, they had gone from defending credit card theft to demanding their monthly housing allowance. I am not paying your mortgage, Mom, I said, enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. I do not have a salary. I am living off my emergency savings. You and Dad need to pay your own bills. Are you out of your mind? Frank roared, his anger genuine now. The facade of the confident patriarch was slipping. You are going to let your own parents end up on the street. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us. If you do not send that money, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? Being unemployed is your fault, not ours. Figure it out. Send the money, Linda added coldly. Do not make us beg. It is humiliating. You are not begging, I replied. You are demanding money from a woman with no job. I am done funding this family. I pulled my phone away from my ear, letting their overlapping shouts of indignation become muffled noise. I walked over to my laptop and opened my browser. While they continued to scream at me through the phone, my mind went back to the fraud alert. Something was bothering me. The backup credit card they supposedly used was an old account I had opened years ago. I specifically remembered keeping it locked in a safe deposit box. There was no physical way Kayla could have swiped it at a boutique in our hometown. I logged into my Experian credit monitoring account. The screen loaded, displaying my current credit score and a list of my active accounts. I scrolled past my primary checking and my student loans, scanning for recent activity. My eyes locked onto the top of the list. My breath caught in my throat. There, sitting at the very top of my credit report, was a brand new platinum credit line. It had an approved limit of $15,000. The account status showed it had been opened exactly 24 hours ago. I clicked on the account details, my heart pounding against my ribs. This was not my old backup card. Kayla had not just memorized my credit card numbers. The billing address for this new platinum card was listed as my parents' house. The authorized user was Kayla. But the primary account holder, the person legally responsible for the $15,000 limit and the devastating interest rates, was me. They had not just stolen my credit card. My mother and my sister had used my social security number to open a completely new line of credit under my name. They had committed federal identity theft. I looked down at my phone. I could still hear Frank yelling about respect and family loyalty. I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call mid-sentence. The silence in my apartment was deafening. They had crossed the line from toxic entitlement into actual felony crimes, and they had done it all while demanding I pay their mortgage. The game was officially over. I stared at the single platinum card on my screen for a long time before my professional instincts took over. If they had opened one fraudulent account, they could have opened more. I immediately opened a new tab and requested a comprehensive credit report from all three major bureaus. The loading icons spun on the screen for what felt like hours. When the full document finally populated on my monitor, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. It was not just the $15,000 limit on the new Platinum card. There were two other active credit lines I had absolutely no knowledge of. One was a retail store card, maxed out at $8,000, consisting entirely of transactions at high-end cosmetic counters and luxury boutiques. The other was a premium travel rewards card with a staggering $12,000 balance. I clicked through the monthly statements, feeling my stomach twist into knots. The charges were a grotesque catalog of my family's vanity. There were flights to Miami booked under Brandon's name. There were expensive salon charges for Linda. There were daily restaurant bills, spa days, and VIP concert tickets. Altogether, my mother and sister had racked up $35,000 in unauthorized debt under my Social Security number. They had weaponized the 9-digit number my mother had memorized from my childhood birth certificate. While I was pulling 60-hour work weeks, sacrificing my youth and my health to build a solid financial foundation, they were literally stealing my identity to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. The sheer scale of the deception was paralyzing. But the physical sensation of being robbed by my own blood was not a new feeling. Looking at those massive balances, my mind violently snapped back to a freezing Tuesday 12 years ago. I was 22 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen with my very first paycheck from my entry-level corporate job. It was for $2,000. I was vibrating with pride and hope. I had planned to use that money to finally move out and buy a reliable used car, so I would not have to take the bus in the brutal Chicago winters. Before I could even open the envelope, Frank walked into the kitchen, his face red and sweating. He snatched the paycheck right out of my hands. He did not ask. He did not explain. He simply told me to endorse it over to him immediately. When I cried and begged him to stop, Linda stood by the sink, arms crossed, telling me to stop being selfish. Brandon had accumulated a massive gambling debt betting on college sports, and the people he owed money to were threatening to show up at the house. "Family protects family," Frank had growled at me, pushing a pen into my hand. "You live under my roof. You owe me this. Your brother made a mistake and we have to fix it." I signed the check while hot tears streamed down my face. Frank took my entire month of wages to save his golden boy from the consequences of his own actions. For the next 30 days, I walked 5 miles to the train station in the freezing snow because I could not afford gas or a bus pass. I ate nothing but 30-cent instant ramen noodles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I remember the sharp, clawing hunger in my stomach during long board meetings. I remember nearly passing out from exhaustion at my desk. And I vividly remember coming home after a grueling 14-hour shift to find Brandon sitting on the couch strumming a brand new electric guitar Frank had bought him to make him feel better about his stressful situation. They did not care that I was starving. They only cared that Brandon was comfortable. My suffering was just the acceptable cost of their happiness. That same sickening feeling returned now, looking at $35,000 of stolen money on my computer screen. But I was no longer a terrified 22-year-old girl who thought she had to buy her parents' love. I was a 34-year-old financial risk analyst, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a threat. I did not pick up the phone to call the police. That would be a purely emotional reaction. A simple police report would give them time to hide their assets, hire a lawyer, or spin a web of lies to the extended family, playing the victims. No, they needed to be backed into a corner they could never escape. They needed to feel the exact same helplessness they had forced upon me for over a decade. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Within 10 minutes, I had contacted Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I executed a hard credit freeze across my entire identity. No new accounts could be opened. No existing lines of credit could be increased. The financial faucet they had been drinking from was suddenly and permanently welded shut. I downloaded every single fraudulent monthly statement highlighting the forged signatures, the shipping addresses, and the specific IP addresses used to open the accounts online. Every piece of data was meticulously categorized and uploaded into my encrypted spreadsheet. I was building an airtight cage around them. Just as I saved the final document detailing Kayla's fake signature, my phone lit up on the desk. It was a text message from Linda. The preview banner on my screen did not show an apology for the $1,200 Prada bag. It did not show a shred of guilt or maternal concern. Instead, it was a perfectly crafted piece of emotional blackmail designed to corner me. "We are having dinner tonight at the steakhouse downtown," the message read. "Your father and I have some very important things to discuss regarding your attitude and your financial obligations to this family. We expect you to be there at 7 sharp. Do not make a scene and do not embarrass us." I stared at the glowing text in the quiet of my apartment. They were trying to summon me to an expensive public place where they assumed my fear of social embarrassment would force me to surrender and agree to pay their mortgage. They thought I was still the obedient, quiet girl they had programmed me to be. I picked up my phone and typed a single simple reply: "I will be there." I locked my screen, a cold smile forming on my face. They wanted to talk about financial obligations in public. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. The steakhouse was exactly the kind of place my parents loved to be seen in when they wanted to project an image of wealth they did not actually possess. Dimly lit with dark mahogany paneling, deep leather booths, and waiters gliding across the room in crisp white jackets, it screamed old money and unapologetic exclusivity. When I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, they were already seated at a prominent booth right in the center of the main dining room. Frank was holding court, gesturing expansively to a waiter, while Linda adjusted her heavy pearl necklace to ensure it caught the light. Brandon and Kayla were slouched on the opposite side of the booth, completely absorbed in their glowing phone screens. I slid into the empty chair next to Kayla, clutching my simple black handbag. No one greeted me with a hug or a warm hello. My mother barely glanced up from her leather-bound menu. "We are celebrating tonight," Frank announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighboring tables. He waved the sommelier over without bothering to consult a single person at the table. "We will start with a bottle of your finest Cabernet, the reserve from Napa Valley. Bring it immediately." I knew exactly which bottle he meant because I had been forced to pay for it during our last family gathering. It was $400. When the waiter came to take our food orders, the sheer gluttony of their choices was staggering. Frank ordered a 32-ounce Wagyu ribeye cooked medium rare, accompanied by a side of truffle mac and cheese and grilled asparagus. Linda requested the twin lobster tails bathed in garlic butter and a jumbo shrimp cocktail starter. Kayla and Brandon both ordered massive center-cut fillets with crab cakes and oysters on the half shell. They ordered without hesitation, their voices dripping with entitlement. The waiter turned to me, his pen poised politely over his notepad. "I will just have the house salad and a glass of ice water," I said evenly, closing my menu and handing it back to him. My mother let out a loud, theatrical sigh that caused a nearby couple to turn and look. "Do not be so incredibly stingy, Leah. It is embarrassing. You are making it look like we do not feed you or that we cannot afford a proper meal. Order a steak." I looked her dead in the eye, my voice steady and cold. "I am unemployed, Mom. I am conserving my emergency savings because I do not have a salary anymore." Frank slammed his heavy hand flat on the table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle. "We are not discussing your career failures tonight. This is a family dinner. We are here to enjoy ourselves, to relax, not to listen to you complain about a financial situation you created with your own insubordination. Do not ruin this evening with your negativity." I remained completely silent as the expensive wine was poured and the extravagant food arrived. They ate with the ravenous entitlement of people who truly believed the universe owed them luxury on a silver platter. I ate my simple mixed greens, observing them gorge themselves on a feast I knew they fully expected me to fund. The conversation flowed rapidly around me as if I were entirely invisible, a ghost haunting my own family dinner. Brandon leaned back against the leather booth, chewing loudly on a thick piece of Wagyu. He held up his phone, showing Kayla a picture of a pristine white sand beach. "I just booked the VIP cabana package for my Miami trip next week," he bragged, wiping grease from his chin. "The promoters down there are begging me to do a set at this exclusive beach club in South Beach. It is going to be legendary. I am flying first class, obviously." I took a slow, measured sip of my ice water. My risk analyst brain automatically ran the numbers. A VIP cabana package in Miami plus first-class flights cost upwards of $3,000. He was actively planning to fund a luxury vacation while throwing a screaming fit earlier that morning over a $15 Spotify subscription I had refused to pay. Kayla was not about to be outdone by her brother's boasting. "Miami is cute," she said, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "But I am focusing on my personal brand and my future right now. I just upgraded my entire wardrobe for my upcoming interviews." She reached into her brand new Prada bag, the very same bag she had purchased with my stolen identity just hours ago, and pulled out a sleek, heavy metal credit card. She tossed it onto the table with a loud metallic clack. "Platinum status." She smirked, admiring the shiny piece of metal resting next to her plate. "The bank practically begged me to take it. They gave me a $15,000 limit right out of the gate. They obviously recognized my earning potential." "You have to spend money to make money, right, Dad?" Frank nodded proudly, raising his wine glass to her. "Exactly. That is the mindset of a winner." I stared at the card sitting on the white tablecloth. My name was not printed on the front, but my social security number was inextricably tied to the magnetic strip on the back. The sheer, unadulterated brazenness of her sitting next to me, flashing a fraudulent credit card secured through federal identity theft, was breathtaking. She had absolutely no idea that I had already frozen the account. She had no idea that her precious piece of status symbol metal was now completely useless. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not scream. I did not snatch the stolen card from the table. I simply smiled a cold, tight smile and finished my salad in silence. They spent the next hour ordering 3 different rich desserts and rounds of expensive espresso, laughing and toasting to their own brilliance. I waited patiently, watching the digital clock on my phone tick forward. Finally, the waiter approached our booth carrying a sleek black leather folder. He placed it discreetly in the center of the table. The damage was done. I could see the printed receipt poking out from the edge of the leather. The total was $1,450. A sum that could cover an entire month of groceries, utilities, and car payments for a normal family blown on a single Tuesday night dinner. The table instantly grew quiet. The loud boasting stopped. Frank did not reach for his wallet. Linda suddenly found the floral pattern on the tablecloth utterly fascinating. Brandon and Kayla returned to scrolling on their phones, completely detaching themselves from the reality of the situation. Frank reached out with one thick finger and pushed the black leather folder directly across the table until it rested right in front of my plate. He looked at me with a demanding, expectant glare that left no room for argument. "Eldest daughter pays as always," he declared, leaning back in his chair with a highly satisfied smirk. "Hand over your card, Leah. We are ready to go." I looked at the black leather folder resting on the pristine white tablecloth. Frank tapped his thick fingers against the polished wood of the booth, waiting for me to dutifully slide my corporate card into the flap, just like I had done hundreds of times before. Linda was already looking away, adjusting her posture to signal that the financial transaction was beneath her notice. Brandon and Kayla did not even pause their scrolling. It was a well-rehearsed routine. The eldest daughter pays the tab and the rest of the family gets to play wealthy socialites. I slowly reached into my simple black handbag. I did not pull out the platinum card they were expecting. Instead, I withdrew 2 crisp $20 bills and a single $5 bill. I placed the $45 neatly next to the leather folder. "That covers my house salad, my ice water, and a 20% tip for the waiter," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. "The rest of the $1,450 bill belongs to you." The silence that fell over our table was absolute. Frank stopped tapping his fingers. His hand froze in midair. He stared at the cash, as if I had just placed a live explosive on his plate. The smug satisfaction completely vanished from his face, replaced rapidly by a deep dark flush of crimson that crept up his thick neck. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Frank hissed, leaning across the table. "Put your credit card in that folder right now, Leah. Do not make me ask you twice." "It is not a joke," I replied, maintaining direct eye contact. "I told you on the phone. I told you when I sat down. I am unemployed. I am not funding your Wagyu ribeye or your $400 bottle of wine. You ordered the feast, you pay the check. Linda let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. She brought a hand to her chest, her eyes darting around the elegant dining room to see if anyone at the neighboring tables had overheard my refusal. When she realized a few diners were casting curious glances our way, she immediately shifted into her favorite role, the victimized mother. Tears welled up in her eyes on command. "Leah, how could you do this to us?" Linda whimpered, her voice trembling with manufactured betrayal. "We are your family. We raised you. You are going to humiliate your father and me in the middle of a fine dining restaurant over a meal. You have thousands in savings. Stop acting like you are destitute and pay the bill." "I am not acting," I stated, ignoring her fake tears entirely. "I am setting a boundary. You are 58 years old, Mom. Dad is 60. You both ate the lobster and the steak. It is time you pay for your own appetite." Frank slammed his fist onto the table again, causing the silverware to clatter against the fine china. "You ungrateful brat!" he growled, his voice rising in panic and fury. "You know our business accounts are frozen right now. We do not have that kind of liquid cash on us tonight. You set us up." "I did not force you to order the most expensive items on the menu," I pointed out clinically. "You did that all on your own because you thought you had a free pass." Suddenly, the tense atmosphere was interrupted by a cheerful voice. "Linda, Frank, what a wonderful surprise." We all turned to see Beverly, one of the wealthiest and most prominent women in my parents' social circle. She was standing next to our booth, draped in a designer silk wrap, smiling warmly. Beverly was exactly the kind of high society connection my mother spent her entire life trying to impress. In a fraction of a second, the fake tears vanished from Linda's face. She sat up perfectly straight, forced a painfully bright smile onto her lips, and completely transformed her demeanor. "Beverly, darling." Linda chimed, her voice dripping with artificial joy. "It is so lovely to see you. We are just having a beautiful family dinner. Our successful daughter Leah insisted on bringing us out tonight to treat us. You know how generous she is with her corporate salary. She simply refused to let us pay." Beverly smiled at me, clearly charmed by the lie. "That is so sweet of you, Leah. It is wonderful to see young people taking such good care of their parents." Frank puffed out his chest, nodding along with the fiction, clearly hoping that the presence of a wealthy family friend would force me into compliance out of sheer social embarrassment. He pushed the leather folder closer to me under the table, giving me a threatening glare. I did not back down. I did not shrink into my seat. Instead, I stood up from the booth, grabbed my coat, and looked Beverly dead in the eye. "Actually, Beverly?" I said, my voice ringing out clearly across the quiet dining room. "That is a complete lie. I lost my job 64 days ago, and my parents are fully aware of it. They ordered $1,450 worth of food and luxury wine tonight, and now they are trying to bully me into paying for it because their own pockets are entirely empty." Beverly's warm smile instantly collapsed into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. She took a physical step back from our table, her eyes darting between my flushed, paralyzed father and my absolutely mortified mother. Linda looked as though she had just been struck by lightning. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy family had just been detonated in front of the one person she cared about impressing the most. Frank looked like he was about to have a stroke, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the veins bulged in his arms. "Well," Beverly stammered awkwardly, clutching her silk wrap, "I should get back to my husband. Have a good evening." She practically ran away from our table, leaving a crater of humiliation in her wake. "You are dead to me," Frank whispered, his voice shaking with a level of rage I had never heard before. "You hear me? Do not ever show your face at our house again." I slung my purse over my shoulder. "That works perfectly for me, Dad. Have a great night." As I stepped out of the booth, Kayla finally looked up from her phone. She scoffed, rolling her eyes at me. "God, you are so poor and pathetic, Leah. Do not worry, Daddy. I will cover the bill. I have my new platinum card right here. The bank gave me a $15,000 limit. We do not need her cheap attitude anyway." Kayla dramatically pulled the shiny metal credit card from her bag and tossed it onto the black leather folder with a smug, victorious grin. Frank and Linda both let out massive sighs of relief, looking at Kayla as if she were their savior. I looked at the shiny card resting on the table. It was the fraudulent card they had opened using my social security number just 24 hours ago. The exact same card I had permanently frozen through the Federal Credit Bureaus that very afternoon. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp, and deeply satisfied smile. "You are right, Kayla," I said smoothly. "You enjoy that platinum status. You earned it." I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the exit. The cool Chicago night air hit my face as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, and I took my first real deep breath in 12 years. I felt lighter than air. I walked down the illuminated street knowing exactly what was about to happen inside that mahogany dining room. In exactly 2 minutes, the waiter would pick up that black leather folder. He would take Kayla's shiny new card to the register. He would swipe it, and the machine would immediately decline the transaction due to the fraud freeze. He would return to the table, politely informing my father that the card was dead. They had no liquid cash. Their business accounts were empty. Their credit was locked. They were currently sitting in one of the most expensive restaurants in the city with a $1,400 bill they had absolutely no way of paying. They were trapped. They would have to sit there humiliated and make desperate phone calls to extended relatives begging someone to drive downtown and bail them out of a luxury steakhouse. The trap had snapped shut and I was already walking away. The morning sun streaming through my apartment windows felt like a victory. I woke up completely refreshed, having slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat on my couch, relishing the absolute silence. I imagined the chaotic aftermath at the steakhouse the night before. I pictured Frank turning purple while desperately calling relatives to bail them out of a $1,400 bill. It was a beautiful thought, but my peaceful morning was shattered at exactly 8 o'clock. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed a local hospital number. My heart skipped a beat, a momentary lapse into genuine familial concern. I swiped to answer. "Leah, thank God you picked up!" Linda sobbed into the receiver. Her voice was trembling, thick with panic and distress. "It is Brandon. He was in a terrible accident this morning. He fell down a flight of concrete stairs while loading his music equipment. His arm is completely shattered. We are at Mercy General Hospital right now." I gripped my coffee mug tightly. "Is he okay?" I asked, my voice guarded. "He is in agony, Leah," Frank barked, snatching the phone from my mother. "The doctors say he needs an emergency surgical procedure to set the bone with pins. But there is a massive problem. The hospital administration just came in here and told us his health insurance lapsed. They are refusing to take him into the operating room until we pay a $5,000 deposit up front." I furrowed my eyebrows. "That is not how emergency rooms operate in the United States, Dad. They have to stabilize him regardless of insurance." "Do not argue with me about hospital policy when your brother is screaming in pain," Frank roared. His voice echoed with righteous indignation. "We are tapped out after the stunt you pulled at the restaurant last night. You humiliated us, and now your brother is paying the price because we cannot afford his deposit. You need to wire $5,000 to my account right this second. Consider it your apology for last night. If you do not send the money, he could lose the use of his hand forever. He is a musician, Leah. You would be destroying his life." The emotional manipulation was heavy and suffocating. They were using a medical emergency to extort money from me while simultaneously blaming me for their financial ruin at the steakhouse. "I will not wire anything to your personal account," I stated flatly. "I will drive to the hospital right now and speak to the billing department directly. If there is a legitimate medical deposit required, I will handle it at the front desk." "Leah, wait!" Linda cried out hastily. "You do not need to come all the way down here. Just send the money." I ended the call. The sudden panic in my mother's voice when I offered to pay the hospital directly set off every alarm bell in my head. My risk analyst instincts were screaming that the numbers did not add up. I threw on a tailored blazer, grabbed my purse, and drove straight to Mercy General Hospital. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency department, I did not rush frantically down the hallways searching for my injured brother. Instead, I walked directly to the patient registration and billing counter. A tired-looking administrative nurse looked up from her computer. "How can I help you?" "Hi," I said, maintaining a polite professional tone. "My name is Leah. I am here regarding my brother Brandon. My parents just called and informed me that he requires a $5,000 upfront deposit for an emergency arm surgery due to lapsed insurance. I am here to settle his account." The nurse frowned, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Give me his date of birth. Let me pull up his file." I provided the information. She clicked through the screens, her frown deepening into a look of complete confusion. "Ma'am, there is no surgical deposit required for this patient," she said softly, turning her monitor slightly. "He came in through the emergency room, complaining of arm pain. The attending physician has not even ordered a surgical consult yet. Furthermore, we absolutely do not demand $5,000 upfront for a broken bone in the ER. That is a violation of federal law." I stood perfectly still, letting the reality of her words wash over me. There was no surgery. There was no deposit. The entire story was a fabricated crisis designed to panic me into wiring cash directly into Frank's bank account. "Wait, there is something else here." The nurse continued, looking closer at the screen. "The patient updated his intake forms this morning. He listed himself as uninsured, but he designated you as the primary financial guarantor. He put down your home address and your phone number for all future medical billing. Did you authorize this?" A cold, sharp fury ignited in my chest. Brandon had intentionally lied to the hospital staff. He had removed his own contact information and substituted mine, legally routing every single hospital bill directly to my mailbox. They were not just trying to extort $5,000 in cash from me today. They were setting me up to be legally responsible for thousands of dollars in medical debt long after they left the hospital. "No, I did not authorize that," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Please remove my name and address from his file immediately. I am not his guarantor. I am not responsible for his debts. I will flag this for the fraud department right away," the nurse said quickly, typing the changes into the system. "Thank you for letting us know. He is currently in room 314 if you want to speak with him." I thanked her and walked away from the desk. I navigated the sterile, brightly lit corridors until I reached room 314. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. I stopped just outside the threshold, preparing to confront them about the fake deposit and the fraudulent billing information. But before I could push the door open, I heard voices floating out from the room. I froze, pressing my back against the wall to listen. "Did she wire the money yet?" Brandon asked. His voice was completely normal. There were no groans of pain, no agony, no distress. "Not yet," Linda replied, sounding highly annoyed. "She insisted on coming down here to pay the front desk. You know how stubborn she is. We have to play this perfectly when she walks in. You need to look like you are in absolute agony." Brandon let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed into the hallway. "Do not worry, Mom. I have got this covered. This fake cast I ordered on Amazon was only $30 and my stupid sister actually bought the whole story. As soon as she hands over that $5,000, I am booking my cabana in Miami. She owes me anyway for cutting off my Spotify." I stood in the hospital corridor, staring blankly at the partially open door. My own brother had bought a theatrical prop cast online and checked himself into an emergency room just to stage a fake medical crisis. My mother was standing right next to him, actively directing the performance. They were treating my empathy and my wallet like a limitless bank account they could hack with a cheap Amazon prop. I did not burst into the room. I did not scream or cry. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the voice memo app. I hit the red record button, holding the phone close to the crack in the door, capturing every single word of their vile, laughing confession. Let them enjoy their fake cast. I now had the exact ammunition I needed to bury them. I walked out of that hospital as a different person. The sound of their laughter through that door did not just break my heart. It incinerated the last remnants of my guilt. I drove back to my apartment in a state of clinical detachment. The tears were gone. In their place was the cold, hard logic of a risk analyst. My family was not a family. They were a predatory liability. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen light felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. I did not go to bed. I did not eat. I began to dig. For years, I had been the one to fix their tech issues. I was the one who set up their passwords. I was the one who created the family iCloud account so they could share photos of the life I was funding. They were too lazy to ever change those credentials. I logged into the shared drive. My eyes scanned through folders labeled with mundane names: tax documents, house repairs, photos. I navigated to a folder tucked away in the archives titled Legal. My breath hitched when I saw a PDF named Probate Court Final Decree. It was dated 3 years ago. I clicked it open. My eyes blurred as I read the headers. The estate of Edward Miller, my grandfather. The man I thought had died with nothing but debt. The grandfather they told me had left me his old watch and nothing more. I scrolled to the distribution section. My hands began to shake with a violent intensity. The court had approved a total distribution of $250,000. The beneficiaries were Frank and Linda Miller. $250,000 in liquid assets and life insurance. I leaned back, staring at the number until it felt like it was carved into my brain. 3 years ago. I remembered that summer vividly. That was the year Frank called me in the middle of the night, hyperventilating. He told me the bank was days away from seizing the house. He said they were going to be homeless if I did not send them $10,000 immediately. I was 28 then. I had just started a new position and was trying to save for my own home. I emptied my small down payment fund and worked 16-hour days for 4 months straight to make up the difference. They had $250,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account while they watched me starve myself and work until my hair started falling out from stress. I dug deeper into the email history. I found a thread between my mother and a local car dealership. 3 weeks after the inheritance cleared, Linda had purchased a brand new luxury SUV for Kayla. Cash, no financing. The same SUV Kayla told me she had earned through a social media sponsorship. There was more. A series of wire transfers to a cryptocurrency exchange. Brandon. My parents had dumped $60,000 into a meme coin project that Brandon was convinced would make him a millionaire. It was a rug pull scam. The money had vanished in 48 hours. And through all of this, for every single one of the 36 months since that inheritance, they had sent me a monthly invoice for $3,200. They told me the mortgage was underwater. They told me the taxes were rising. They told me they were skipping meals to keep the lights on. They were not just taking my money. They were stealing my life. They were treating my labor as a slush fund for their vanity and Brandon's idiocy. I looked at the spreadsheet I had been building since I lost my job. I had given them $460,000 over 12 years. If I had invested that money in the index funds I managed for my clients, I would be a millionaire today. I would not be worried about a layoff. I would have my own estate. The irony was that I had spent my career protecting corporations from people like them. I was paid to see the red flags. I was paid to identify the bad actors. I had been so blinded by the word family that I had let the biggest fraudsters in the country sit at my own dinner table. A new sense of clarity settled over me. It was not anger anymore. It was an executive decision. When a company is hemorrhaging cash to a corrupt department, you do not just stop the funding. You liquidate, you audit, you ensure they can never embezzle a single cent again. I opened a new encrypted chat window on my desktop. I typed a name into the search bar. Jason. Jason was more than just a friend. He was a brilliant developer and my business partner. For the past 18 months, we had been working in the shadows. While my family thought I was just a corporate drone, Jason and I were building ClearDebt. It was a revolutionary fintech application designed to identify predatory lending patterns and protect users from financial fraud. We had been waiting for the right moment to go full-time. I picked up the phone and dialed his private line. It was 3 a.m. Leah. Jason answered, his voice thick with sleep but immediately alert. Is everything okay? You never call this late. I am out, Jason, I said, my voice echoing in the empty apartment. The job is gone. The family is gone. The blindfold is off. What happened? They tried to fake a medical emergency tonight to get $5,000 for a trip to Miami, I told him. I could hear his sharp intake of breath. And I just found the probate records. They have been sitting on $250,000 while I paid their mortgage for 3 years. They have used my identity to open credit cards. They have spent almost $500,000 of my life. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jason knew the basics of my family's dependency, but he had no idea it was this pathological. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. "I am done being a safety net," I said. "I want to initiate the final phase of clear debt. I want to pull the plug on every single account I have ever touched. But I need more than that. I need a full legal audit of every cent that went into that house. I want the mortgage records. I want the titles." "Leah, you are talking about a war." "No, Jason," I replied, looking at the recording of Brandon laughing in the hospital room. "I am talking about a foreclosure. My parents think that house belongs to them. They have told the whole world they are the kings of their little castle. They have forgotten one very important detail, which is, when the bank was going to take it 10 years ago, I did not just send them a check. I had my lawyer draft a private purchase agreement. I let them live there as tenants. I hold the deed, Jason. I have owned that house since I was 24. I have just been too kind to remind them." "Holy moves," Jason whispered. "Prepare the legal files." I said, my finger hovering over the spreadsheet that would end their world. "I am going to audit them into oblivion. I am going to destroy them." I hung up the phone. I looked out at the city as the first light of dawn began to touch the skyscrapers. Thanksgiving was coming. The family was expecting a feast. They were going to get a reckoning instead. I spent the rest of the morning drafting the emails. Each one was a surgical strike. To the bank, to the insurance companies, to the cell phone providers. By noon, the digital infrastructure of their lives was beginning to crumble. But I was not going to give them the mercy of a quick death. I wanted them to sit in the darkness for a while. I wanted them to realize that the person they called a failure was the only reason they had a roof over their heads. I sent one final group text to the family chat. "I hope you had a good laugh at the hospital. I have sent each of you a personal gift for the holidays. Check your emails. Thanksgiving is canceled." I hit send and felt the weight of 12 years vanish. The ATM was not just broken. It was gone. And I was the one who held the keys to the vault. The fallout from my refusal to pay Brandon's fraudulent $5,000 hospital bill did not happen immediately. Frank and Linda were cowards at their core. They knew they could not manipulate me directly anymore, especially not after I had cut off their financial supply and sent that final text canceling Thanksgiving. Instead of calling me to argue, they deployed a classic tactic used by toxic families everywhere. They launched a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign to completely destroy my character. It started on a Thursday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the legal documentation Jason had compiled for our upcoming software launch when my phone vibrated. Then it vibrated again. Within 60 seconds, a barrage of text messages flooded my screen. They were not from my parents or my siblings. They were from extended family members I had not spoken to in years. I opened a message from my mother's sister, Aunt Patty. The text was a massive block of angry paragraphs. "Leah, I am absolutely disgusted by your behavior," the message read. "Your mother just called me in tears. I cannot believe you were fired from your firm for corporate theft. After all the sacrifices your parents made to put you through college, you resort to stealing from your employer, and now to hear that you are heavily using narcotics and refusing to go to rehab. You are a monster for attacking your family when they are only trying to save your life. Do not ever contact me again until you are clean and ready to apologize." I stared at the screen, my heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. Corporate theft, narcotics, rehab. The sheer magnitude of the lies was breathtaking. Frank and Linda had not just painted me as an ungrateful daughter, they had fabricated a severe career-ending criminal history and a debilitating drug addiction to explain away my sudden unemployment and my withdrawal from the family. It was a preemptive strike. By convincing the entire extended family that I was a paranoid, drug-addicted thief, they ensured that if I ever tried to tell the truth about the stolen inheritance or the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had given them, no one would believe a word I said. It was the perfect gaslighting strategy. My phone chimed again. This time, it was Uncle David Frank's older brother. "Your father is a broken man today, Leah. To hear that you are suffering from a psychotic break and lashing out at your siblings is heartbreaking. We are organizing an intervention. You need psychiatric help. Threatening to make your parents homeless because you are high out of your mind is a new low. Get help." The messages kept pouring in. Cousins, family, friends, even a former high school teacher who was still connected with my mother on Facebook. They all echoed the same fabricated narrative. I was a thief. I was a junkie. I was violently paranoid. I was abusing my generous, loving parents who were desperately trying to get me into a treatment facility. A younger version of myself would have panicked. The old Leah would have immediately called Aunt Patty and Uncle David, crying hysterically, begging them to believe her, desperately trying to prove her innocence. I would have sent them bank statements and termination letters just to clear my name. But the woman sitting at that kitchen island was a risk analyst. I knew that engaging with a smear campaign only gives it oxygen. Arguing with flying monkeys who have already bought into the lies is a massive waste of time and energy. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type a single defensive reply. Instead, I opened a new folder on my encrypted hard drive and named it Defamation. In the United States, spreading false information that destroys a person's professional reputation or accuses them of a crime is called defamation per se. It is highly actionable in civil court. By spreading written and verbal lies about me committing corporate embezzlement and possessing illegal narcotics, Frank and Linda were actively jeopardizing my future career in the financial sector. They were handing me a massive, incredibly lucrative lawsuit on a silver platter. I methodically opened every single text message, Facebook comment, and voicemail. I took high-resolution screenshots. I logged the timestamps, the senders, and the exact nature of the allegations. I created a digital paper trail of every single lie they had planted. I forwarded the entire batch of evidence to Jason with a brief note attached. "Add these to the legal file. Slander and libel. We will add a defamation lawsuit to the impending eviction." Jason replied less than a minute later. "They are digging their own graves. The paperwork is almost ready." I closed my laptop, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. Let them talk. Let them spin their fictional tragedies to anyone who would listen. The truth does not need to scream to be heard. It just needs the right courtroom. The real-world consequences of my financial freeze were moving much faster than their pathetic rumor mill. While they were busy working the phones to destroy my reputation, the automated systems of American commerce were quietly executing my orders. It happened the very next afternoon. I was on a video call with Jason, finalizing the user interface for our application, when the intercom system in my apartment buzzed violently. It was a harsh, aggressive sound that startled me. I walked over to the wall panel and pressed the talk button. "Yes, Ms. Miller. It is the front desk security." The concierge said, his voice tense. "I have 2 police officers here in the lobby. They are escorting a young woman who claims to be your sister. She is extremely agitated and demanding we let them up to your floor. She says you have stolen her vehicle." A cold smile spread across my face. It was time for Kayla to face reality. "Send the officers up," I replied calmly. Less than 2 minutes later, a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed through my hallway. Someone was slamming their fists against my solid wood door. "Leah, open this door right now!" Kayla shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice completely hysterical. "Open the door! You are going to jail!" I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Kayla was standing in the hallway, her face streaked with ruined mascara, looking absolutely deranged. She was wearing a designer tracksuit, clutching her phone like a weapon. Standing right behind her were 2 uniformed Chicago police officers, looking highly unamused by the situation. "She stole my car!" Kayla screamed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Tell the police what you did." I was driving down Michigan Avenue right in the middle of traffic, and a tow truck literally hooked my car and dragged it away. The driver said the insurance was canceled and the lease was in default. You canceled my insurance on purpose to have my car repossessed. Arrest her. She committed grand theft auto. I looked past my hysterical sister and focused entirely on the two police officers standing in my hallway. They looked exhausted, clearly regretting being dragged into what was rapidly revealing itself to be a domestic dispute. Kayla continued to scream, her voice echoing off the walls of my building. She pointed her manicured finger at me, demanding they put me in handcuffs for grand theft auto. "Ma'am, please step back and lower your voice," the older officer instructed Kayla firmly. He turned his attention to me, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Are you Leah Miller? Your sister here claims you illegally canceled the insurance and ordered a repossession on a vehicle that belongs to her. We need to ask you a few questions." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match Kayla's frantic energy. I simply nodded and stepped aside, keeping the door wide open. "Officers, I am Leah Miller." I said, my tone as professional and detached as if I were in a boardroom. "I am perfectly willing to answer any questions you have. However, the woman screaming in my hallway is lying to you. I did not steal her car, nor did I illegally repossess it. I simply stopped paying for a vehicle that I legally own." Kayla let out a theatrical gasp. "You are a liar. Mom and Dad bought me that SUV for my graduation. It is mine. You just hacked into the account out of pure spite because you are a miserable junkie." I ignored her completely. I turned back to the officers. "If you give me exactly 30 seconds, I will provide you with the legal documentation." I walked over to my desk, picked up a thick blue folder, and returned to the doorway. I handed the folder directly to the older officer. He opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. "What you are looking at is the official state title, the original dealership purchase agreement, and the current registration for the vehicle in question," I explained calmly. "As you can clearly see, my name, Leah Miller, is the sole name on the title. I am the exclusive owner. My parents did not buy that vehicle. I financed it and I paid the monthly premiums. I allowed my sister to use it as a courtesy. Since I recently lost my job, I can no longer afford to subsidize her luxury transportation. I canceled the insurance and notified the dealership to terminate the lease agreement. The tow truck driver was acting on a lawful repossession order from the bank." The officer looked from the title deed to Kayla, his expression hardening into stern irritation. He handed the folder back to me. "Miss, this vehicle is registered entirely under your sister's name," the officer said, turning to address Kayla directly. "She is the legal owner. She has every right to cancel the insurance and surrender the vehicle to the bank. This is not grand theft auto. This is not even a police matter. You have filed a false report." Kayla's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from her face. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "But Dad said it was mine. He said you were just handling the paperwork." "Dad lied," I stated flatly. "Just like he lied about me being a drug addict." The younger officer stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises immediately. You cannot use emergency services to settle family financial disputes." I held up my hand before they could escort her to the elevator. "Officers, actually, I would like to file a formal report right now." My sister came to my private residence uninvited. She has been banging on my door and screaming accusations in my hallway, disturbing the peace of my neighbors. She also brought law enforcement here under deliberately false pretenses. I want a harassment report filed on the record." The older officer pulled out a small notepad. "Understood, Ms. Miller. We will document the disturbance and the false vehicle report." Kayla absolutely lost her mind. The reality of the situation finally shattered her delusional bubble. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward, but the younger officer quickly stepped into her path, holding up a warning hand to stop her. "You are a psycho!" Kayla shrieked, her voice cracking as tears of rage streamed down her face. "You set me up. You planned this just to humiliate me. You are dead to me, Leah." I wish you would just drop dead so we never have to deal with you again. Step toward the elevator right now, or you will be leaving this building in handcuffs for disturbing the peace. The officer warned, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Kayla let out a primal scream of frustration, stomping her designer sneakers against the carpet. She spun around and marched toward the elevator, sobbing loudly and shouting curses that echoed down the corridor. The officers apologized to me for the inconvenience, took down a few final notes for the harassment report, and followed her to ensure she left the property without causing any further damage. I closed the heavy wooden door and slid the deadbolt into place. The apartment was blissfully quiet again. I walked over to the kitchen counter and poured myself a fresh glass of water. My hands were completely steady. I had just watched my sister get escorted out by the police, and I felt absolutely nothing but clinical satisfaction. Less than 5 minutes later, my cell phone erupted. The screen flashed furiously with a picture of my father. I knew exactly what was coming. Kayla had undoubtedly called him the second she stepped out of my building. I tapped the screen and accepted the call, holding the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. Frank did not wait for a greeting. His voice exploded through the speaker, a deafening roar of absolute rage. "You dared to call the police on your own sister!" he bellowed, his breath rattling against the microphone. "You had her humiliated in front of the authorities over a piece of metal. You are sick in the head. You are a complete disgrace to this family." I took a slow sip of my water, letting him scream himself hoarse. "Listen to me very carefully," Frank snarled, his tone dropping into a dark, threatening growl. "Tomorrow night, the entire extended family is gathering at my house. We are holding a meeting to discuss your mental breakdown and your vicious attacks on us. You are going to show up. You are going to sit there and face the judgment of this family. If you do not walk through my front door tomorrow evening, you are cut off forever. Do not ever call me your father again." The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered the phone, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. He still thought it was his house. He still thought he was the one in control. Tomorrow night they wanted a family trial. I was going to give them an execution. The invitation to my own execution arrived exactly as I anticipated. I stared at the text message from my father for a long time. It was not a request. It was a summons. The entire extended family was gathering for a pre-Thanksgiving dinner at what he boldly referred to as his house to pass judgment on my supposed mental breakdown. I typed a single word in response. Confirmed. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked into my home office. I bypassed my computer and went straight to the discreet digital safe hidden behind a framed abstract print on my wall. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying clunk. I reached past my passports and emergency cash, pulling out a thick, pristine manila envelope. The front was stamped with a bright red notary seal. I slid the heavy parchment papers out of the envelope and spread them across my mahogany desk. The ink was a decade old, but the legal weight of the words remained absolutely devastating. 10 years ago, I was 24 years old and barely 2 years into my corporate finance career. I had been living like a monk, saving every single bonus and agonizing over every expense to build a massive safety net. That was the year the housing market caught up with Frank and Linda's reckless spending. They had treated their home equity like a limitless credit card, borrowing against the house to fund luxury vacations and Brandon's expensive hobbies. When the final foreclosure notice was taped to their front door, they completely fell apart. I remember walking into their living room and finding them surrounded by cardboard boxes, weeping about being thrown into the street. They had begged me to drain my savings to pay their massive arrears. But even at 24, my risk analyst instincts were sharp. I knew that handing them cash was like pouring water into a sinking ship. They would just refinance again and lose the house anyway. So I made a clinical executive decision. I did not give them a dime. Instead, I went directly to the bank. I used my entire life savings, every cent I had painfully hoarded, to purchase the property in a short sale. I took on the mortgage solely under my name. I became the absolute legal owner of the property. I allowed them to stay. I drafted a private lease agreement charging them a nominal rent that barely covered the property taxes, which they consistently failed to pay anyway, forcing me to cover the difference month after month. But narcissism is a powerful drug. Over the past decade, Frank and Linda did not just ignore the reality of their situation. They completely rewrote history. They hosted lavish summer barbecues and holiday parties standing on the back deck with glasses of expensive wine, bragging to the extended family about the soaring property value of their beautiful suburban home. They boasted about the new landscaping and the upgraded kitchen appliances, conveniently omitting that I had paid for every single renovation. They paraded around as the successful wealthy patriarch and matriarch of the family. They completely erased my ownership from their reality, convincing themselves that my monthly financial support was simply a dutiful daughter paying tribute to their greatness. They actually believed the house belonged to them. They believed the fortress they were using to host my public trial was their sovereign territory. I ran my fingers over the raised red seal on the official property deed. My name, Leah Miller, was printed clearly as the sole grantee. They wanted to hold a tribunal to excommunicate me from the family. They wanted to kick me out of their kingdom. It is physically impossible to kick a landlord out of her own property. I neatly folded the deed and the original purchase agreement back into the manila envelope and slid it into my sleek leather briefcase. I picked up my phone and dialed Jason. He answered immediately, the background noise of his keyboard clacking indicating he was already hard at work on our software launch. "Jason, I need a favor," I said, keeping my voice brisk and professional. "I need you to secure a high-definition mini projector and a portable projection screen. Can you have them ready by tomorrow afternoon?" "I can have them in my car in an hour," Jason replied. Not missing a beat. "Are we doing a pitch meeting?" "Something like that," I told him, looking at the red seal poking out of my briefcase. "I am attending the family gathering tomorrow night. They have invited the entire bloodline to stage an intervention about my supposed drug addiction and criminal behavior. I need to deliver a very clear, very visual presentation. I want the spreadsheet displayed on a screen large enough for the people in the back row to read every single transaction." "I will drive you," Jason stated firmly. "You are not walking into a hostile environment alone. I will handle the tech setup. You just handle the execution." I thanked him and ended the call. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. This was not a family dinner. This was a corporate liquidation, and I needed to dress accordingly. I bypassed the casual sweaters and jeans. I pulled out a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray power suit. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stilettos that sounded like gavels hitting wood when I walked. I wanted to look exactly like the ruthless financial analyst they claimed had lost her mind. I wanted them to look at me and feel an immediate primal sense of dread. The next evening, the sky was bruised with dark, heavy clouds as I walked down to the street level. Since Kayla's dramatic performance with the police had resulted in my actual car being temporarily parked in a secure garage to avoid any further vandalism from her, I had rented a sleek black luxury sedan for the night. I slid into the driver's seat. Jason was already waiting in the passenger seat, a black canvas bag containing the projector resting securely on his lap. "Ready to burn the bridge?" Jason asked, buckling his seatbelt. I gripped the leather steering wheel. "I am not just burning the bridge, Jason. I am selling the land it was built on." I shifted the car into drive and pulled smoothly into the Chicago traffic. I drove steadily toward the affluent suburbs, navigating the familiar tree-lined streets I had grown up on. The GPS chimed, indicating we were approaching the destination. I turned the corner and saw the sprawling two-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Every single window was blazing with light. Cars lined the entire driveway and spilled out onto the street. Aunts, uncles, cousins. They had all come to watch the spectacular downfall of the ungrateful daughter. I parked the rental car directly in front of the manicured lawn I paid to maintain. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal suit. I grabbed my leather briefcase, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement as I walked up the driveway to my own house. I did not knock. I simply inserted my key into the brass lock of the front door, turned it, and pushed it open. The heavy mahogany door swung wide, revealing the grand foyer I had paid to renovate 5 years ago. Jason stepped in right behind me, quietly closing the door with a solid, definitive thud that echoed through the sudden, suffocating silence of the house. I walked straight into the main living room. The sheer scale of the ambush was almost impressive. Approximately 20 relatives were crammed into the expansive space, occupying every sofa, armchair, and dining chair dragged in for the occasion. Aunts, uncles, and older cousins sat shoulder to shoulder, forming a literal wall of judgment. Their eyes tracked my every movement, filled with a toxic mixture of pity, disgust, and self-righteous contempt. Right in the center of the room, positioned like a Supreme Court judge presiding over a highly publicized criminal trial, sat Frank. He was reclined in his oversized leather armchair, his hands steepled beneath his chin, projecting an aura of profound, heartbreaking disappointment. To his right sat Brandon, cradling his completely fraudulent Amazon prop cast against his chest, looking like a wounded war hero. To his left sat Kayla, her arms crossed, tightly glaring at me with raw hatred. And then there was Linda. My mother did not even wait for me to take a seat or say a single word before she launched into her Oscar-worthy performance. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, shuddering wail that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She stood up unsteadily, leaning against the armrest of the sofa, as if the mere sight of me was physically draining her life force. "I do not know what I did wrong," Linda sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly on the vowels. "I do not know what terrible sin I committed as a mother for you to heartlessly try to kill your own brother and throw your sister out on the street. We gave you nothing but love, Leah. How could you become this monster?" A collective gasp of sympathetic horror rippled through the audience of relatives. Several aunts nodded in grim agreement, offering Linda tissues and whispering words of comfort. I stood perfectly still in my charcoal power suit, my leather briefcase held loosely in my left hand. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I watched her perform with the detached fascination of a scientist, observing a predictable chemical reaction. The silence stretched for a moment, thick and heavy, waiting for me to break down, to cry, to beg for their forgiveness, or to start screaming defensively. When I did absolutely nothing, the crowd grew restless. They needed a villain to attack. Aunt Susan, Linda's older sister, could not contain her outrage any longer. She shot up from her seat near the fireplace, her face flushed dark red. She marched forward, stopping just a few feet away from me, and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful wretch!" Aunt Susan spat, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Your parents raised you, they paid for your education, and now you are a drug addict and a traitor. You are standing there looking at us like you are better than everyone else while your brain is entirely rotted from narcotics. You should be down on your knees begging your father to send you to a rehabilitation center." I looked at Aunt Susan. I noted the expensive gold watch on her wrist, a watch Linda had gifted her 2 years ago using funds transferred directly from my bank account. I looked at Uncle David, who was vigorously shaking his head in disgust, completely unaware that his beloved brother Frank had stolen my first corporate paycheck to cover a gambling debt. They were all so confidently, aggressively wrong. They were weaponizing their ignorance to execute me in the court of family opinion. Frank finally raised his hand, a magnanimous gesture to silence the room. He looked at me with sorrowful, heavy eyes. "We did not bring you here to attack you, Leah," Frank lied smoothly, his voice deep and resonant. "We brought you here because we love you. We are a family, and families do not let their own sink into the abyss of addiction and insanity. We are prepared to forget the horrific things you have done this week. We are prepared to overlook the corporate theft that cost you your job. But you have to admit you are sick. You have to hand over your finances to me so I can manage your recovery, and you have to apologize to your brother and sister right now." It was the ultimate trap. If I argued, I was the crazy defensive addict. If I stayed silent, I was guilty by default. They had cornered me perfectly, relying entirely on my fear of public humiliation to force my compliance. I did not say a single word. I did not defend myself against the drug accusations. I did not scream at Brandon for wearing a $30 plastic cast. I did not yell at Kayla for stealing my identity. I simply turned my back on Aunt Susan, walked right past Frank's imposing armchair, and approached the massive 70-inch smart television mounted on the living room wall. It was the exact television I had purchased for them last Christmas. A nervous murmur swept through the room as they watched me. I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. I reached behind the flat screen and plugged the drive directly into the primary port. I picked up the television remote resting on the media console and switched the input source. The large screen instantly flashed black. The reflection of 20 confused, anxious faces stared back at me for a fraction of a second. Then the display flared with a blinding, crisp white light. Massive, bold, jet-black letters appeared across the center of the 70-inch screen, completely dominating the room. The murmurs instantly died. The entire house plunged into an absolute, breathless, deathly silence. The text on the screen read simply, "The truth about the ungrateful daughter." I pressed the small button on the wireless presenter in my hand. The title slide vanished from the 70-inch television screen. In its place, a massive, meticulously formatted Excel spreadsheet illuminated the dimly lit living room. The bright white background of the digital document cast a harsh, unforgiving glow across the faces of my extended family. I turned to face the room, my posture perfectly straight, my voice ringing out with the crisp, undeniable authority of a corporate auditor delivering a final financial report. "Let us review the accounting of my supposed drug addiction and mental breakdown," I announced clearly. I pointed the laser of my presenter at the screen. Column A displays the recipient of the funds. Column B displays the exact dollar amount of the transaction. Column C calculates the running total of my stolen youth. I paused, letting their eyes adjust to the sheer volume of data scrolling rapidly down the screen. 144 months. $3,200 every single month. A grand total of $460,800. That is the exact amount of liquid cash I have poured into this family over the last 12 years. A collective gasp swept through the living room. It was not a quiet murmur. It was a sharp, physical intake of breath from 20 different people, simultaneously realizing they had been entirely manipulated. Aunt Susan dropped her hand from her chest, her jaw hanging slack as she stared at the undeniable banking records flashing before her eyes. Uncle David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from the screen to his brother Frank in utter disbelief. I pressed the clicker again. The spreadsheet transitioned into a slide deck of high-resolution, undeniable visual evidence. "Here are the bank transfer receipts for the mortgage of the very house you are all sitting in right now," I stated, pointing to a collage of PDF bank statements. $2,500 wired directly from my checking account to the bank on the first of every month for a decade. Frank and Linda Miller did not pay for this luxury suburban fortress. I did. I kept the roof over your heads while you told everyone at your country club that you were successful real estate investors. I clicked to the next slide. "Here are the wire transfers for Kayla Miller." I continued, my voice steady and relentless. University tuition payments she claimed she secured through a fictional academic scholarship, auto insurance premiums for her luxury SUV, thousands of dollars in direct cash deposits so she could maintain her fake social media influencer lifestyle. Kayla shrank back into the leather sofa, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She looked frantically around the room, but no one was rushing to defend her. The aunts and uncles who had just been pitying her were now staring at her with narrowed, judging eyes. I clicked to the third slide. A chaotic collage of airline receipts, hotel bookings, and equipment invoices filled the screen. "And here is the financial profile of the starving artist Brandon Miller," I declared, locking eyes with my brother. "Over $40,000 in the last 5 years alone. First-class airline tickets to Miami. Studio rental fees for a music career that has generated absolutely zero revenue. A luxury apartment deposit he lost because he refused to pay his own rent." Brandon hugged his cheap Amazon prop cast closer to his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but the sheer weight of the financial documentation crushed the words in his throat. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, addressing the entire room. Drug addicts do not possess perfect credit scores and $500,000 cash surplus to fund their siblings' vacations, I told them, my gaze sweeping across the silent relatives. People experiencing psychotic breaks do not maintain meticulous financial spreadsheets detailing a decade of extortion. You are all invited here tonight to stage an intervention for a monster. But the monsters are the ones sitting in the center of this room spending my money while actively destroying my professional reputation to cover their own tracks. The illusion was dead. The perfect, wealthy, generous Miller family narrative had been completely eviscerated by hard data. Frank could not take it anymore. The reality that his entire extended family was currently watching irrefutable proof of his financial parasitism snapped his fragile ego in half. His face turned a dangerous mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he practically threw himself out of his oversized leather armchair. "Turn that garbage off right now," Frank roared, his voice shaking with absolute panic and blind rage. "That is entirely fabricated. She is a liar. Turn the television off." He charged forward like a cornered animal, his heavy boots stomping across the hardwood floor. He lunged past me, reaching his thick arms behind the media console, desperately trying to grab the power cord to rip it straight out of the electrical socket. He needed the screen to go black. He needed the evidence to disappear. He never even touched the wire. Jason, who had been standing quietly by the heavy mahogany front door, moved with startling speed. He stepped smoothly into the center of the room and placed his large frame directly between Frank and the television console. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He simply stood there, an immovable physical barrier, protecting the presentation. "I would highly advise against damaging my electronic equipment," Frank, Jason said. His voice was incredibly calm, dangerously even, and completely devoid of fear. "Step away from the console and go sit back down in your chair." Frank skidded to a halt, his chest heaving as he stared up at Jason. For a split second, Frank looked like he might try to throw a punch. But bullies only attack people they know they can control. Faced with a younger, stronger man who was completely unfazed by his temper tantrum, Frank hesitated. He looked around the living room, desperately seeking an ally. He found none. Uncle David was staring at the floor, shaking his head in disgust. Aunt Susan looked physically ill. The rest of the family sat frozen in a heavy, judgmental silence. No one was going to help him unplug the truth. Frank let out a ragged, defeated breath. He turned around and slowly walked back to his armchair, collapsing into the leather cushions. The Supreme Court judge had just been stripped of his gavel. I smiled, a cold, clinical expression of absolute victory. I raised the presenter and pressed the button one more time. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by an audio file icon. The financial audit was over. It was time for the criminal disclosures. The silence following the disappearance of the spreadsheet was heavy and suffocating. The extended family sat frozen, their eyes darting between me and the four people sitting in the center of the room. The sheer volume of money I had handed over was still sinking into their minds. But Linda was not going to surrender without a fight. She had spent her entire adult life twisting reality to suit her narrative, and she was going to try one last desperate maneuver. Linda shot up from the leather sofa, her face contorted in a mask of righteous indignation. She pointed a trembling finger at the blank television screen. "That means absolutely nothing!" Linda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceiling. "You are our daughter. That money was a gift. It was your duty to help your family. You volunteered every single cent of that money out of filial piety. You cannot just throw a tantrum because you lost your job and suddenly decide to weaponize your own generosity. We never forced you to pay for anything. You offered." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, amazed by the absolute lack of shame in her eyes. She was standing in a house I bought, wearing clothes my credit card paid for, and screaming that my extortion was voluntary. I raised the wireless presenter in my right hand. "Voluntary filial piety," I repeated slowly, letting the words roll off my tongue with deliberate precision. "Let us examine exactly how voluntary my contributions have been. Let us look at how this family manufactures emergencies to extract that filial piety." I pressed the central button on the remote. The audio file I had recorded through the crack of the hospital door began to play. I had run the file through an audio enhancement software, boosting the volume and isolating the vocals so every single syllable was crystal clear. The sound blasted through the expensive surround sound speakers I had purchased for their living room 2 Christmases ago. Brandon's voice filled the room, first loud, arrogant, and completely devoid of pain. "Do not worry, Mom. I have got this covered. This fake cast I ordered on Amazon was only $30, and my stupid sister actually bought the whole story. As soon as she hands over that $5,000, I am booking my cabana in Miami." Then came Linda's voice, captured perfectly on the recording, sounding impatient and scheming. "She insisted on coming down here to pay the front desk. You know how stubborn she is. We have to play this perfectly when she walks in. You need to look like you are in absolute agony." The audio clip ended. The silence that slammed back into the living room was absolute, deafening, and completely suffocating. The entire extended family turned their heads slowly, simultaneously, to look at Brandon. He was still sitting rigidly in his chair, his healthy arm wrapped protectively around the $30 plastic prop cast he had bought online. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. He opened his mouth, stammered a completely incoherent sound, and snapped it shut again. Linda collapsed back onto the sofa as if her legs had suddenly given out. She buried her face in her hands, but this time there were no theatrical sobs. She was completely silent. She knew there was no spinning this. She had been caught on tape orchestrating a medical fraud against her own unemployed daughter to fund a luxury vacation. Aunt Susan, who just minutes ago had been screaming at me to go to rehab, took a very deliberate physical step backward. She moved away from Linda, her face contorted in pure disgust. Uncle David stood up from his chair and walked to the far side of the room, looking at Frank and his family as if they were carrying a highly contagious disease. The wall of judgment had completely flipped. The extended family was no longer looking at me with pity or contempt. They were looking at Frank, Linda, and Brandon with absolute revulsion. I was not finished. The execution had just begun. That was yesterday morning, I announced, my voice cutting through the thick, toxic air of the room. A $5,000 medical scam. But why stop there? Let us review what happened 24 hours prior to the hospital incident. Let us look at how the golden child of the family secures her luxury wardrobe. I clicked the presenter again. The screen flashed brilliantly white once more. A massive high-resolution image of a platinum credit card approval statement appeared. Right beside the statement was a highly technical color-coded digital log. I had Jason highlight the critical data points in bright, undeniable red. $35,000 in total debt, I stated, pacing slowly across the hardwood floor. 3 separate credit cards. Maxed out at luxury boutiques, high-end cosmetic counters, and travel agencies. All opened within the last 48 hours. And all opened using my personal social security number. Kayla let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She pressed her back hard against the sofa cushions, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her eyes darted wildly toward the front door, looking for an escape route that Jason was currently blocking. You might try to claim that my identity was stolen by a random hacker on the internet. I continued, pointing the laser directly at the technical log on the right side of the screen. But I am a financial risk analyst. I do not just freeze fraudulent accounts, I track them. My cybersecurity team pulled the exact IP address used to submit those fraudulent credit card applications. I traced the laser down to the bottom of the screen, circling a string of numbers. That IP address maps directly to the primary router in this exact house. More specifically, the device signature matches the exact MAC address of the laptop sitting on the desk in the upstairs bedroom. Your bedroom, Kayla. Kayla burst into tears. Real, panicked, terrified tears. She looked at Frank, grabbing his arm and shaking it. Dad, do something, she sobbed hysterically. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell her to take it down. Frank could not even look at her. He was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, his entire empire of lies crumbling into dust around his feet. I stepped closer to the sofa, looking down at my younger sister. I wanted her to feel the absolute gravity of her actions. I wanted her to understand that the shield of family protection was gone forever. You did not just steal money, Kayla, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal tone. You committed federal identity theft. The mandatory sentencing guidelines for identity fraud of this magnitude carry a penalty of 2 to 5 years in federal prison. And I have already submitted the complete digital dossier to the Financial Crimes Division of the Chicago Police Department. The air was completely sucked out of the room. The word prison hung over them like a guillotine. The reality of their actions had finally breached the walls of their suburban delusion. They were not just facing social embarrassment anymore. They were facing the absolute destruction of their lives. The silence in the room was no longer just a reaction to the shock of identity theft. It had morphed into a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief. The reality of federal prison time hung directly over Kayla, who was now weeping silently into her hands, completely stripped of her usual arrogance. But before Frank could even attempt to formulate a pathetic defense for his youngest daughter, a deep, booming voice shattered the quiet of the living room. Uncle John stepped forward from the back of the room. He was a stern, pragmatic man, someone who had always respected Frank as the supposedly successful patriarch of the family. Now his face was twisted in a mask of absolute righteous fury. He pointed a finger directly at his brother. Frank, what is the meaning of this? Uncle John demanded, his voice shaking with anger that reverberated off the walls. You called me 2 days ago. You sat on the phone and swore to me that Leah was a drug addict. You told me she was fired for corporate theft and was destroying this family with her psychotic paranoia. You asked me to come here tonight to stage an intervention for a junkie. Now I am looking at federal fraud logs and fake hospital casts. You lied to all of us. Frank opened his mouth, his face a canvas of panicked desperation. The confident, booming executive persona had completely vanished. John, please, you have to understand. It is complicated. We were just trying to protect the girls. We were under a lot of financial pressure and Leah was being entirely unreasonable. I did not let him finish that pathetic sentence. I pressed the button on my wireless presenter one more time. If you want to talk about financial pressure, Dad, let us put absolutely everything on the table right now, I said, my voice slicing through his excuses like a scalpel. Let us show everyone in this room exactly how much pressure this family was actually under. The television screen transitioned instantly. The red laser of my presenter circled the top of the new document. It was not a bank statement or a credit report. It was an official court-stamped legal document with heavy black lettering. I watched the realization hit the older members of the family. They recognized the format of a probate court decree immediately. 3 years ago, I announced addressing the entire room but keeping my eyes locked dead onto Frank. 3 years ago, my grandfather passed away. Frank and Linda sat me down in this very living room and told me with tears in their eyes that he had died practically destitute. They told me he left nothing behind but old debts and a few personal items. They said they needed my $3,200 a month more than ever to cover the funeral costs and to keep this very house from going into immediate foreclosure. I pointed the laser directly at the bolded number in the center of the glowing screen. That was a complete fabrication, I stated coldly. This is the finalized probate document from the estate. My grandfather did not die in debt. He left exactly $250,000 in liquid assets, and the sole beneficiaries of that money were Frank and Linda Miller. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded room. Uncle John took a massive step back, his eyes wide with horror. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with both hands, looking as though she might be physically sick. $250,000, I repeated, letting the massive sum echo off the high ceilings. While I was working 14-hour days, skipping meals, and draining my own emergency savings to pay your mortgage because you claimed you were starving, you were sitting on $250,000 in untaxed cash. Frank's face drained of all color. He looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. Linda tried to open her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed by the exposure of her ultimate greed. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a pie chart and a series of highlighted bank transfer receipts. Let us look at exactly how you spent my grandfather's legacy. While continuing to bleed your eldest daughter dry every single month, I continued mercilessly. You took $60,000 of that inheritance and dumped it into a fraudulent cryptocurrency project that Brandon insisted would make him a millionaire. It vanished in 48 hours. You took another $80,000 and bought a brand new luxury SUV for Kayla in cash. You spent the rest on country club memberships, premium wine, and luxury vacations to pretend you were part of the upper class. I walked directly up to Frank's armchair. I looked down at the man who had terrorized me with his impossible expectations and financial demands for my entire adult life. This is the reason I have no money right now. I told him, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet whisper that everyone in the room strained to hear. Because the very people who called me a failure, the people who said I was a disappointment, who could not hold down a job, hoarded $250,000 to travel and play the stock market. You watched me burn myself out. You squeezed every last drop of my salary out of my bank account while you were sitting on a massive fortune. Frank could not hold my gaze. His broad shoulders collapsed inward. His chest caved. The illusion of the strong, successful father figure completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He slumped down into the heavy leather of his armchair, suddenly looking like a very old, very pathetic, and very small man. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His pride, his reputation, and his manufactured authority were entirely annihilated in front of the exact people he cared about impressing the most. Linda, realizing that the entire room had fundamentally turned against them, resorted to her final desperate tactic. She threw herself forward onto the glass coffee table and began to wail. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical sound that grated against the ears. She cried out about how hard it was to manage money, about how she just wanted her children to have nice things, about how she was a good mother who had simply made some bad choices under stress. She reached her shaking hands out toward Aunt Susan, begging for a hug, begging for someone to validate her victimhood and tell her it would be okay. No one moved. Aunt Susan literally turned her back on her sister, crossing her arms tightly in rejection. Uncle John stared at Frank with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The cousins and extended relatives whispered among themselves, their faces tight with absolute disgust. Not a single person walked forward to hand Linda a tissue. Not a single person offered a word of comfort or an ounce of pity. She was left weeping wildly on the floor, completely and utterly isolated by her own toxic greed. I stood tall in my sharp charcoal suit, watching the absolute destruction of their social standing play out exactly as I had calculated. I had not laid a single hand on them. I had not raised my voice or thrown a tantrum. I had simply presented the math, and the math had executed them perfectly. The heavy, suffocating silence in the living room was broken only by the pathetic sound of Linda weeping against the glass coffee table. Frank remained slumped in his oversized leather armchair, completely paralyzed by the public annihilation of his false empire. The extended family was entirely speechless. They were staring at my parents with a mixture of absolute horror and profound disgust. The intervention they had been invited to witness had turned into a financial autopsy, and the results were hideous. But narcissism is a deeply ingrained disease, and my sister Kayla was severely infected. She could not comprehend the magnitude of the data presented on that 70-inch screen. She could not process the fact that her entire existence was funded by my stolen labor and federal fraud. All she understood was that her pristine, wealthy image was being torn to shreds in front of our wealthiest relatives. Kayla leaped up from the leather sofa, her face contorted into a mask of pure, irrational fury. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at the heavy mahogany front door. "Get out!" Kayla shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "Get out of our house right now! You are a jealous, spiteful liar. You came here to ruin my life and embarrass Mom and Dad because you are a miserable failure. I do not care what your stupid spreadsheets say. Get your things and get out of our house immediately." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I simply looked at her and smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that caused the surrounding aunts and uncles to physically lean back in their chairs. I turned away from her screaming face and walked deliberately toward my leather briefcase resting on the media console. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my stilettos against the hardwood floor sounded like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of their suburban delusion. Jason stood perfectly still by the entryway, watching the scene unfold with absolute focus. He knew exactly what was inside the briefcase. I unlatched the leather flap. I reached inside and pulled out the thick manila envelope I had retrieved from my hidden safe just hours ago. The bright red notary seal stamped on the front of the heavy parchment paper caught the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. I walked back to the center of the room. I stood directly over the glass coffee table where Linda was still sobbing. With a swift, fluid motion, I tossed the heavy legal document onto the glass. It landed with a sharp, definitive slap that made Frank violently flinch in his armchair. "You seem to be operating under a massive delusion, Kayla," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the vast, silent room. "This is not your house. It is not Mom and Dad's house." I pointed to the thick stack of legal papers resting on the table. 10 years ago, while you were busy taking out student loans, you never intended to repay Frank, and Linda defaulted on their mortgage. They received a final foreclosure notice from the bank. They were exactly 3 days away from being physically thrown onto the street by the county sheriff. I was 24 years old. I took every single cent of my life savings, the money I had bled for during my first years in corporate finance, and I bought this property in a cash short sale to save them from absolute ruin. A collective gasp swept through the room for the third time that evening. Uncle David stood up from his chair entirely, his eyes wide with shock. Aunt Susan gripped the edge of the mantel, staring at Frank as if she were looking at a complete stranger. I turned my gaze away from Kayla and locked eyes with Frank. He looked like he was about to vomit. "I hold the deed," I announced, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet tone. "I am the sole legal grantee of this property. My name is the only name on the title. You are not wealthy real estate investors. You are not the successful patriarch and matriarch of this family. You are nothing but non-paying tenants living in a house owned by the daughter you spent a decade calling a failure." The absolute destruction of Frank's ego was a physical thing to witness. The man who had spent 10 years hosting lavish summer barbecues on the back deck, bragging to these very relatives about his soaring property values and his expensive kitchen renovations, was entirely exposed as a fraud. I had paid for the deck. I had paid for the kitchen. I had paid the property taxes every single year because they consistently failed to hand over the nominal rent we had agreed upon. They had stolen my house and worn it like a costume to impress the people sitting in this very room. Frank Uncle David breathed out, his voice thick with betrayal. "You told me you paid off this mortgage 5 years ago. You told me you owned this estate free and clear. You let your daughter buy the roof over your head, and then you dragged us here to call her a drug addict. You sicken me." Frank could not speak. He merely shook his head, his hands trembling violently against the armrests of his chair. Kayla had collapsed back onto the sofa, staring at the red notary seal on the coffee table, as if it were a venomous snake. Her brain was finally processing the fact that the luxurious suburban castle she used as the backdrop for her social media influencer videos belonged entirely to the sister she despised. But the financial audit was only the prologue. The execution was the finale. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. I withdrew 3 crisp, legally binding documents, each printed on heavy white cardstock. I did not hand them over politely. I stepped forward and threw the first document directly into Frank's lap. I dropped the second document onto the glass table right in front of Linda's tear-stained face. I tossed the third document onto Brandon's lap, hitting his $30 fake Amazon cast. "Those are official 30-day eviction notices," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable authority. "I filed them with the county court yesterday morning. You have violated the terms of your lease agreement by committing federal identity theft under my roof and failing to pay rent for 64 consecutive days." Linda let out a horrific, strangled scream. She grabbed the eviction notice, her eyes darting across the legal text, searching frantically for a loophole that did not exist. Brandon stared at the paper in his lap, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. His free ride was officially over. He was going to have to get a job. "You cannot do this," Frank choked out, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. "We are your parents. You cannot throw us into the street right before the holidays. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked down at the people who had drained my bank account, stolen my identity, and attempted to destroy my professional reputation, all to save their own vanity. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, refreshing clarity of total liberation. "You have $250,000 in stolen inheritance money," I reminded him coldly. "I am sure you can find a lovely apartment to rent." I picked up my leather briefcase and turned toward the heavy mahogany front door where Jason was waiting. I did not look back at the sofa. I did not look back at the crying mother or the defeated father. "Thanksgiving is canceled this year," I announced to the silent room, pushing the front door open to the crisp, freezing Chicago night. "You have exactly 30 days to get your trash out of my house." The door of the suburban house clicked shut behind me and the execution was officially complete. But the real torture for Frank and Linda did not begin in that living room. It began the very next morning when the sun rose on their newly demolished reality. The social exile was absolute and instantaneous. The extended family did not just quietly distance themselves, they orchestrated a ruthless, coordinated boycott. Uncle David formally removed Frank from the Family Investment Trust Board before 9 in the morning. Aunt Susan blocked Linda on every social media platform, but not before sending a mass email to their entire country club circle detailing exactly how Linda had embezzled $250,000 from a grieving widow's estate. The phone in the house stopped ringing with invitations to charity galas and holiday parties. Instead, it rang with angry relatives demanding repayment for old debts Frank had conveniently forgotten. They were completely radioactive. They thought the silent treatment from their wealthy friends was the worst punishment imaginable. They were spectacularly wrong. The actual nightmare arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days after I handed them their eviction notices. I was sitting in the downtown Chicago office space Jason and I had just leased for our startup, watching the security camera feed from the exterior of my property. 2 vehicles pulled up to the manicured driveway. One was a standard black and white patrol cruiser. The other was an unmarked dark sedan. 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective from the Financial Crimes Division stepped out onto the pavement. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and watched the monitors with clinical satisfaction. I had handed the police a perfectly organized digital dossier containing IP addresses, time-stamped fraudulent applications, and undeniable proof of identity theft. Law enforcement rarely moves quickly on financial crimes, but when you hand a detective a completely solved case wrapped in a neat bow, they do not waste time. The detective pounded heavily on the thick mahogany front door. The sound echoed through the high-definition audio feed on my laptop. It took a full minute before the door crept open. Linda stood there wearing a silk robe, her face pale and drawn. She immediately attempted to deploy her practiced high society matriarch persona, offering a strained, polite smile to the officers. The detective did not return the smile. He did not care about her pearls or her address. He held up a gold badge and stated his business with brutal efficiency. He demanded to see Kayla Miller immediately. Linda stammered, trying to block the doorway, claiming her daughter was resting and could not be disturbed. The detective informed her that he possessed a federal arrest warrant and would gladly charge Linda with obstruction of justice if she did not step aside. The threat of her own arrest shattered Linda's maternal resolve instantly. She stumbled backward, pointing a shaking finger up the grand staircase. Kayla appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later. She was wearing expensive designer loungewear, clutching her phone, likely preparing to film a morning routine video for her non-existent social media followers. When she saw the police officers standing in the foyer, the phone slipped from her fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. "Kayla Miller." The detective announced, his voice carrying up the stairs. "You are under arrest for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and credit card fraud. Come down here immediately." Kayla let out a high-pitched guttural scream of absolute terror. She refused to move, gripping the banister as if it could protect her from the federal penal system. The two uniformed officers did not hesitate. They marched swiftly up the stairs, grabbed her by both arms, and forcefully hauled her down to the foyer. Frank finally emerged from his home office, his face purple with rage. He tried to puff out his chest, using his booming executive voice to demand the officers release his daughter, claiming this was all a massive family misunderstanding. The detective simply handed Frank a copy of the warrant and advised him to hire a very good defense attorney. I watched through this camera feed as the officers pulled Kayla's arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly. Kayla thrashed and sobbed violently, begging her father to do something, begging her mother to call the mayor. But Frank and Linda could do absolutely nothing. They stood frozen in the foyer as the police paraded their screaming handcuffed golden child out the front door and down the driveway in broad daylight. Every single neighbor on the street had stepped out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. The wealthy, prominent Miller family was being publicly gutted, and their disgrace was now a matter of public record. With Kayla sitting in a holding cell facing multiple felony charges, the reality of their financial ruin finally crashed down on them. A criminal defense attorney requires a massive cash retainer, and Frank's bank accounts were entirely empty. They had squandered the stolen inheritance. Their credit was destroyed. They had absolutely no liquid assets left to save their favorite daughter from prison. Desperation breeds miserable compromises. Frank turned his attention to his 31-year-old son. Brandon, who had spent the last 5 days hiding in his bedroom, was suddenly drafted into the crisis. The family needed cash, and Brandon's room was a treasure trove of stolen funds. Under Frank's furious, screaming orders, Brandon was forced to dismantle his entire delusion. I watched the driveway camera later that afternoon as Brandon hauled heavy equipment out the front door. The fake Amazon cast was miraculously gone. His supposedly shattered arm was functioning perfectly as he carried 2 vintage Gibson guitars, a massive professional mixing console, and a set of high-end studio monitors toward his beat-up sedan. These were the exact items Frank had purchased for him using the money I had sacrificed during my 20s. Brandon drove straight to a pawn shop 2 towns over. He sold his entire musical identity, the career he claimed was just about to take off, for absolute pennies on the dollar. He returned home with just enough crumpled cash to secure a bottom-tier lawyer for his sister. His rockstar dreams were completely dead sold off to keep his sister out of a federal penitentiary. The complete collapse of her family finally broke Linda's stubborn pride. That evening, as I sat in my office reviewing a new contract with Jason, my cell phone screen lit up. It was Linda's number. She had bypassed the block by calling from a prepaid phone. I picked up the device. I did not decline the call. I swiped to accept it and held it to my ear. I did not say a single word. "Leah, please," Linda sobbed into the receiver. The sound of her weeping was raw, hideous, and completely stripped of its usual theatrical polish. She was genuinely terrified. "Leah, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have to call the police and drop the charges against your sister. They have her in a holding cell. She is crying. She is terrified. She will not survive in prison. She is just a girl. She made a mistake." I listened to the frantic, ragged breaths of the woman who had happily watched me starve to pay her bills. "We have lost everything." "Leah," Linda wailed, her voice cracking with pure despair. "The house is gone. Your father cannot find work. Our friends will not even look at us. Brandon sold all his equipment. We have absolutely nothing left. Please, you have made your point. You won family intervention. Just call the detective and tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will do whatever you want. I will get on my knees and apologize. Just save your sister. Please, Leah, say something." I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. I looked at Jason, who was watching me with a silent, respectful understanding. I thought about the 12 years of financial extortion. I thought about the stolen inheritance. I thought about the lies, the manipulation, and the sheer, unadulterated cruelty they had inflicted upon me for over a decade. Linda continued to sob through the speaker, begging for a mercy she had never once granted me. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the red button on the screen. I pressed it with my thumb. The line went completely dead. I dropped the phone face down onto my desk and went back to work. 30 days is exactly 720 hours. I tracked every single one of them with the clinical precision of a ticking time bomb. Frank and Linda had spent the entire month cycling through various stages of grief, anger, and pathetic attempts at manipulation. They sent letters. They left voicemails from burner phones. They even tried to have Uncle David negotiate a lease extension on their behalf. I ignored all of it. A legal eviction notice is not a negotiation tactic. It is a promise. On the morning of the 30th day, the sky over their affluent Chicago suburb was an uncompromising icy gray. I did not stay in my downtown office to watch this final act through a pixelated security camera feed. I wanted to see the physical collapse of their kingdom with my own two eyes. I parked my rented black sedan at the end of their manicured cul-de-sac, blending perfectly into the upscale neighborhood. I held a cup of black coffee, my heater running silently, and I waited for the authorities to arrive. At precisely 8 in the morning, two county sheriff cruisers turned onto the street. Their lights were not flashing, but the distinct black and white vehicles commanded immediate attention. They pulled directly into the wide paved driveway of my property. Frank and Linda had clearly spent the last month living in a state of absolute denial. They had assumed I would cave at the final hour. Because of this profound delusion, they had not hired professional movers. They had not carefully packed their belongings into organized labeled boxes. When the sheriffs knocked heavily on the front door, demanding they vacate the premises immediately, total chaos erupted inside the house. I watched through the windshield of my car as the front door swung open. A sheriff stood on the porch, a clipboard in hand, giving them their final legal warning. 10 minutes later, a sputtering rust-covered moving truck rattled down the pristine street. It was the cheapest, smallest commercial rental truck available, covered in faded decals and dented side panels. It looked like a massive rusted metallic insult parked right in front of the multi-million-dollar suburban estate. The physical evacuation was a spectacle of absolute humiliation. Without the funds to hire a moving crew, Frank, Linda, and Brandon were forced to carry their own belongings out the front door under the watchful eyes of armed law enforcement. There were no sleek cardboard moving boxes. They were dragging black plastic garbage bags stuffed with designer clothes and throwing them roughly into the back of the filthy truck. Brandon emerged first, his supposedly shattered arm functioning perfectly as he hauled a heavy, oversized television toward the ramp. He was sweating profusely, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. Linda followed closely behind, struggling to carry a stack of unboxed kitchenware. Her hair was completely unstyled, her posture hunched and defeated. The high society matriarch, who had practically demanded a red carpet wherever she walked, was now hauling frying pans in a pair of stained sweatpants. But Frank's destruction was the most poetic. He walked out carrying a bundle of cheap plastic hangers and a trash bag full of shoes. The broad-shouldered, booming executive who loved to brag about his real estate prowess to anyone who would listen was now visibly trembling. The noise of the rusty truck and the presence of the sheriff cruisers had successfully drawn the attention of the entire neighborhood. In an exclusive cul-de-sac, a forced police eviction is the ultimate scandal. Front doors opened. Neighbors stepped out onto their sprawling porches. I spotted Beverly, the wealthy socialite from the steakhouse, standing at the edge of her driveway with her husband. They were not offering to help. They were standing with their arms crossed, whispering to each other, their eyes locked on Frank as he shamefully tossed a garbage bag into the rental truck. Frank looked up and made direct eye contact with Beverly. I could practically see his soul leave his body from halfway down the street. The intense, burning shame radiating from him was palpable. He quickly averted his gaze, ducking his head down, trying desperately to hide his face from the people he had spent a decade trying to impress. He was entirely stripped of his pride, his status, and his fake wealth. He was nothing but a broke, disgraced man being thrown out of a house he never actually owned. It took them 2 agonizing hours to stuff their remaining possessions into the rusted truck. When the sheriff finally locked the heavy mahogany front door and handed the keys to my waiting property manager, Frank climbed into the driver's seat of the moving truck. The engine turned over with a loud, embarrassing screech that echoed across the manicured lawns. As the truck began to slowly back out of the driveway, a sleek white van pulled up to the curb. My high-end real estate agent stepped out accompanied by a property assistant carrying a heavy wooden post and a large, pristine metal sign. Frank hit the brakes. The moving truck halted in the middle of the street. He rolled down his manual window, his eyes wide as he watched the real estate agent drive the wooden post deep into the center of the perfectly green front lawn. The sign was elegant, bold, and absolutely unmistakable. For sale. But it was the number printed on the luxury rider attached to the top of the sign that delivered the final lethal blow. $1.2 million. Frank stared at the sign, his face twisting into a mask of pure agony. He had lost his corporate job. He had lost his golden child to a federal holding cell. He had lost his social standing. And now he was forced to look at the exact mathematical value of his ultimate defeat. The daughter he had relentlessly called a worthless failure had just flipped the very house he used to build his fake empire. I was about to walk away with over $1 million in pure profit completely legally while he was driving a rented rust bucket toward a tiny cramped apartment he could barely afford. I sat in my dark sedan sipping the last of my cold coffee. I watched Frank's face crumble as the sheer weight of my financial victory crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. He slowly rolled up the window, put the truck into drive, and rattled down the street, disappearing forever from the wealthy neighborhood he had sacrificed everything to be a part of. I put my car in gear and drove in the opposite direction. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I had a multi-million-dollar property to sell and a $50 million tech company to run. The dead weight had finally been cut loose. 90 days is a remarkably short period of time for a complete structural collapse of an entire human existence. Exactly 3 months after the heavy mahogany door of my suburban property clicked shut behind them, Frank, Linda, and Brandon were living a reality they could not have comprehended in their worst nightmares. They had been forced to relocate to a cramped, decaying 2-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The building sat next to a busy industrial train track, ensuring that the walls shook with a deafening rattle every 45 minutes. There were no manicured lawns. There were no crystal chandeliers. There was only the harsh, flickering buzz of cheap fluorescent lighting and the lingering smell of stale grease from the fast food restaurant on the ground floor. The financial reality of their situation was absolutely brutal. Frank, the man who used to swirl $400 glasses of wine and bark orders at country club waiters, was now wearing a poorly fitted, scratchy polyester uniform. He had managed to secure a job as a frontline security guard at a discount supermarket chain. He spent 8 hours a day standing on aching, arthritic knees, checking receipts, and being completely ignored by disrespectful teenagers. His booming executive voice was entirely useless in the fluorescent aisles of a grocery store. Brandon was faring even worse. Without my bank account to fund his luxurious studio sessions and first-class flights, his fabricated music career had instantly vaporized. To pay his share of the exorbitant legal fees for Kayla's impending federal fraud trial, he had been forced to take a job as a manual laborer at a massive logistics warehouse. The hands he used to claim were too delicate for real work were now permanently covered in thick, painful blisters. His back ached constantly from lifting heavy cardboard boxes onto wooden pallets for minimum wage. The fake Amazon cast he had used to extort me was a distant, pathetic memory compared to the actual physical agony he endured every single day. On a damp Tuesday evening, the three of them were sitting around a wobbly, scratched laminate dining table. Linda was serving a dinner consisting of boiled hot dogs and generic brand baked beans served on chipped ceramic plates. The silence in the tiny apartment was heavy and toxic. They did not speak to each other much anymore. The shared delusion of their wealth had been the only glue holding their family dynamic together, and without it, they were just 3 bitter, exhausted strangers sharing a miserable space. Frank picked up the cheap plastic remote control and turned on the small, outdated television resting on a milk crate in the corner of the room. He turned the channel to CNBC. It was a pathetic habit of his, a daily ritual of self-torture, where he watched the financial markets and corporate news to pretend he was still part of the executive class. He chewed a piece of rubbery meat and stared blankly at the screen. The evening broadcast returned from a commercial break. The lead anchor, a sharp woman in a royal blue suit, looked directly into the camera with an expression of enthusiastic professional interest. "We turn now to a massive breaking story out of the Chicago tech sector," the anchor announced crisply. In a market where many startups are struggling to secure capital, one highly innovative fintech application has just shattered expectations. The platform is called Clear Debt, and it is revolutionizing the way everyday consumers protect themselves from predatory lending, hidden financial abuse, and identity theft. Frank paused. His plastic fork hovered halfway to his mouth. Brandon looked up from his plate, a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread pooling in his stomach. The news broadcast cut from the studio to a live feed of a massive, brightly lit press conference stage in downtown Chicago. The backdrop was a sleek, minimalist banner displaying the pristine Clear Debt logo. Flashbulbs from dozens of industry photographers fired rapidly. Walking confidently onto the center of that stage was a woman wearing a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray power suit. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was calm, lethal, and radiating absolute, untouchable authority. It was me. A digital chyron appeared at the bottom of the television screen in bold, undeniable text. Leah Miller, founder and chief executive officer, Clear Debt. Frank dropped his fork. It hit the chipped ceramic plate with a sharp clack, slipping off the edge and tumbling onto the cheap linoleum floor. He did not blink. His jaw unhinged as he stared at the 70-inch high-definition broadcast of the daughter he had relentlessly branded a useless, pathetic failure. Linda let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Brandon pushed his chair back from the table, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated shock. "Today marks a monumental milestone for consumer financial protection," I stated smoothly into the microphone on the television broadcast, my voice carrying the crisp articulation of a seasoned industry titan. Clear Debt was built on a very simple premise. No one should ever have their future destroyed by financial parasites, especially those operating under the guise of trust. We engineered this algorithm to detect toxic debt traps and unauthorized credit utilization before they can ruin a life. The irony radiating from the television screen was absolute and devastating. I had literally built a multi-million-dollar technology company based entirely on the defensive strategies I had developed to survive my own family. I had monetized the exact security protocols I used to lock them out of my bank accounts. The news anchor's voiceover returned as the camera continued to show me commanding the stage. "The industry agrees with Miller's aggressive vision," the anchor continued cheerfully. "Just hours ago, a premier Silicon Valley venture capital firm acquired a 20% minority stake in Clear Debt. The injection of capital has officially brought the startup to a verified market valuation of $50 million. $50 million. The number echoed through the cramped, miserable two-bedroom apartment. Frank let out a ragged, wheezing breath, clutching his chest through his cheap security guard uniform. $50 million. It was a sum of money so vast, so completely incomprehensible, that it physically crushed the air out of the room. They had destroyed their entire relationship with me over a $5,000 fake hospital bill and a stolen credit card. They had traded a $50 million safety net for a fraudulent Prada bag and a handful of economy flights to Miami. But the execution on the screen was not entirely finished. The television camera panned away from my face to show the front row of the press conference audience. Sitting in the very center seat, wearing an expensive tailored suit, was a man I recognized intimately. It was the senior vice president of the financial firm that had laid me off just months prior. The man who had signed the paperwork declaring my position redundant. He was not looking at me with the dismissive gaze of an employer. He was standing on his feet, clapping enthusiastically, his face beaming with the eager, desperate respect of a corporate executive looking at someone vastly more powerful than himself. He was applauding the very woman he had fired, watching her ascend to a financial throne he could never hope to reach. Frank stared at the screen, his eyes bloodshot and watering. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands. He looked at his son, who was rubbing the aching, blistered muscles of his arms. He looked at his wife, who was sitting in a dingy apartment wearing stained clothes. The daughter they had kicked, mocked, and attempted to bleed dry was currently standing on national television, recognized as a $50 million tech visionary. And they could not touch a single solitary cent of it. They were permanently locked out of the vault, condemned to watch my empire rise from the absolute bottom of the abyss they had dug for themselves. The golden light of a New York City sunset spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, casting a warm glow over the white marble kitchen island. 50 floors below, the heartbeat of the city was a distant hum, but inside the air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary, sage, and a perfectly bronzed 20-pound turkey. It was Thanksgiving, and for the first time in my 34 years, the air did not feel heavy with the suffocating weight of expectation or the sharp sting of calculated insults. There was no one here to tell me I was a failure. There was no one here to demand a $3,000 wire transfer before the first course was served. Jason stood by the wine cooler, expertly uncorking a bottle of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than my parents used to demand for their monthly mortgage. He looked up and caught my eye, a genuine relaxed smile spreading across his face. Beside him were 3 other members of our executive team and 2 friends who had stayed by my side when I was eating ramen and hiding from my own sister's police reports. This was my chosen family. They were people who respected my mind, valued my time, and had built an empire alongside me from the wreckage of my old life. I picked up the carving knife, feeling the weight of the silver in my hand. It was a surgical tool, and today I was performing the final operation on my past. I looked at the turkey, a masterpiece of tradition, and began to slice through the tender meat with a steady, practiced hand. As I worked, my mind flashed briefly to the Thanksgiving dinner of the previous year. I remembered sitting at a crowded table in a house I legally owned, being told by my mother that I was lucky to even be invited. I remembered my father checking his watch, waiting for me to finish my meal, so I could go into the office and print out his business reports. I remembered the hollow ache in my stomach that no amount of food could fill. The contrast between that memory and this reality was so sharp, it was almost physical. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic vibration echoed against the hard marble of the kitchen island. My phone was face up, right next to the platter of sliced turkey. The screen ignited, displaying a notification that made the entire room feel a fraction colder. Incoming call, Frank Miller. I did not stop carving. I watched the phone vibrate until it went to voicemail. 2 seconds later, it lit up again. Incoming call, Linda Miller. I continued to slice the turkey, my movements fluid and clinical. Then came the notifications. They flooded the screen like a digital landslide. 1, 5, 10, 15 missed calls. My parents were calling with a frantic, desperate intensity that they had never shown during the 64 days I was unemployed. They were not calling because they missed me. They were not calling because it was a holiday. They were calling because 3 days ago, my face had been on every financial news network in the country. They were calling because the daughter they branded a junkie and a thief was now worth more than their entire suburban social circle combined. My phone buzzed with a series of text messages. Because I had unblocked them just for this day to witness their inevitable descent, the words appeared in clear view on the screen. Leah, please answer, my mother's text read. Your father is having a very hard time. His back is acting up again, and we are so lonely this year. We made a terrible mistake, honey. We were just stressed and didn't have all the facts. Can we please just meet for coffee? We are your parents. We love you more than anything. I felt a small, dry chuckle catch in my throat. Love. It was a word they used like a currency, something to be traded for mortgage payments and luxury bags. They didn't love me when I was escorted out of my office. They didn't love me when I was facing $35,000 in fraudulent debt they created. They only loved the $50 million valuation attached to my name. The next text came from Frank. Leah, I am proud of what you have built. I always knew you had that Miller drive in you. Let us put the past behind us. We are family. Blood is thicker than water. Let us have a real family dinner this weekend. Tell us where you are." I set the carving knife down and picked up the phone. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel the urge to scream or list their sins. I felt something far more powerful, absolute indifference. I scrolled through the 15 missed calls and the string of manipulative, syrupy messages. I saw a text from Brandon asking for a loan to cover his new apartment deposit, and a message from Kayla's public defender asking if I would consider a character statement to reduce her sentence. They were all still there at the bottom of the abyss, reaching up with greedy hands to pull me back down. They still viewed me as a resource to be harvested. I looked at Jason. He was watching me, his glass of wine held mid-air, waiting for my cue. He knew exactly what was on that screen. He had been there for every legal filing and every late-night coding session. He knew that my mercy had been exhausted years ago. I turned back to the phone. With a few swift, deliberate taps, I navigated to the contact settings. I selected Franklin to Brandon and Kayla. One by one, I hit the button that would permanently sever the final thread. Block contact. I did not send a final sting. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reply. I simply erased their ability to ever reach me again. I deleted the message thread, cleared the call log, and set the phone face down on the marble. The digital silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I am done being a safety net for people who were willing to let me fall, I thought. I am done being an ATM for a family that viewed my survival as a secondary concern to their status. I picked up my glass of crystal clear, expensive white wine and walked over to the dining table. My friends were already seated, laughing and sharing stories of our recent success. The city lights of New York twinkled like a million tiny diamonds through the glass, a kingdom I had built with my own hands and my own resilience. Jason stood up and raised his glass toward me. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to the smartest risk analyst I have ever known." I clinked my glass against his, the sound of the fine crystal ringing out like a bell of liberation. "To freedom," I replied, my voice steady and full of a peace I had never known. "And to the best investment I ever made myself." I took a sip of the wine, the crisp flavor, a perfect ending to a 12-year nightmare. I was no longer the Miller family's failure. I was no longer the ungrateful daughter. I was the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in 32 years, I was exactly where I belonged. The screen faded to black as the sound of genuine laughter filled the room. The most profound lesson we can take from this story is that blood does not automatically make someone family, and loyalty should never be a one-way street. For years, Leah believed that sacrificing her financial security and emotional well-being would eventually earn her parents' love and respect. She poured her hard-earned money into an endless void, hoping to fix their constant mistakes. But the harsh reality she discovered is that you can never buy genuine affection from people who only view you as a financial resource. Toxic individuals do not appreciate your endless sacrifices, they simply come to expect them. When you finally stop being useful to them, their true predatory character is instantly revealed. This incredible journey teaches us the absolute necessity of setting firm boundaries even with those closest to us. Society often pushes the narrative that we must always forgive and accommodate our relatives no matter how poorly they treat us. However, this story completely shatters that dangerous myth once and for all. Tolerating financial and emotional abuse is not a sign of familial duty. It is a guaranteed recipe for total self-destruction. Leah only found true peace and massive professional success when she finally stopped trying to save people who were actively trying to drown her. She used her logic and her courage to cut the toxic ties and built a beautiful new life surrounded by people who truly valued her mind and her character, not just her wallet. Ultimately, we learned that our self-worth is never defined by the people who mistreat us. Sometimes the most empowering decision you can possibly make is to permanently walk away from the table where respect is no longer being served. You have every right to protect your peace, your hard-earned assets, and your future without feeling guilty. Please share your own experiences with setting difficult family boundaries in the comments below, and hit the subscribe button for more empowering stories of self-discovery and healing.